Welcome to our second webinar in this two-part series that we are calling When Disaster Strikes. We're excited by the fact that this is a collaboration between two sections of the International Federation of Library Associations, IFLA, the Asia Oceania Division, and the Library Buildings and Equipment section. We aim to use current research and the experience of responders to examine how we might better prepare for that call that we all hope we will never have to get. The lessons we can learn from others are an important positive legacy that can come out of disaster. I'm Ben Meunier, the University Librarian at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and I'll be hosting this event alongside my colleagues from the National Library of Scotland, Linda MacMillan, who is the head of estates there, and her colleagues. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the IFLA Library Buildings and Equipment section YouTube channel after the event. The first webinar from this series is already on the YouTube channel, so you can watch that at your leisure. All three of our speakers today have valuable knowledge and experience of responding when disaster strikes. The things that you will hear and see will provoke reflection and evoke questions. So we've allowed a good amount of time after the presentations to allow for discussion. Some of our speakers may not be available after the session for the Q&A, so we've undertaken to feed back any questions that participants have, and we'll refer those to our speakers and arrange for some email Q&A, and we can always post the questions and answers onto the YouTube channel as well afterwards. If you have any questions either during the course of the presentations or after, please post those in the chat, and Linda will be monitoring the questions as they come in. I'd like to welcome our first speaker now. Janet Fletcher is the current secretary of the IFLA Library Buildings and Equipment section. Janet is also the library director at the Australian Catholic University. Previously, Janet was the University Librarian at Victoria University of Wellington in Wellington, New Zealand. And Janet's presentation will tell us what disasters teach us in the digital age and describes the impacts of the Kaikoura earthquake on Wellington in New Zealand and the library's response and lessons learned. So if we could queue up the video, please. Lydia, over to you.
Hello everyone. Today I'm going to provide you with a short presentation called Dark Clouds and Silver Linings: What Disasters Teach Us in the Digital Age. I'm going to talk about the impact of an earthquake on a university library service. The Kaikoura 7.8 magnitude earthquake occurred just after midnight on the 14th of November 2016. The Kaikoura region is on the east coast of the South Island of New Zealand. The earthquake caused complex ruptures and 2 deaths. It was felt across a wide area of the country. Victoria University of Wellington is in Wellington, the capital city of New Zealand. This is located on the southern end of the North Island. The earthquake caused substantial damage to several buildings in the city. At the university, there was minor damage to some of the buildings. However, the 10-story building where the main library is, which you can see on the slide here, was closed for 3 months due to major damage to the elevator shafts. The building also houses other university sections such as Information Technology and Research Office directorates. The number of impacted staff was about 400, and of course it impacted all our academic staff and student community. It took just under 2 years for the building to have working elevators again. At the time, I was University Librarian at the university, and I was made responsible for the building recovery, which meant liaising with structural engineers, property services personnel and many other people to ensure that the university community remained safe during the works, and of course meaning that the library services were kept operating as well as possible. This slide shows what the entry of the main library normally looks at on the left-hand side and what it looked like when the building was closed during the first 3 months of the earthquake. Of course, the immediate impact of the earthquake was that our large building was closed. The silver lining was that the time of the year that the earthquake occurred was a quiet time, so the impact was less than if it had been the start of a semester, for example. And another silver lining was that we had a business continuity plan already prepared, and that helped us very much in those very early days. It was obvious pretty quickly that there would be some very major engineering challenges that we would have to deal with to make the building safe. The print collections we identified as primarily being undamaged, but they were obviously unavailable. The National Library of New Zealand and Archives New Zealand were also closed, and this impacted our services because we could not rely on these institutions to support us whilst we were closed. So we also used many of our networks very quickly, all our university library colleagues across New Zealand and internationally, as well as many of our vendors were very quick to offer assistance. We were able to relocate our library staff everywhere across the university, and we created a temporary service point just outside the closed library. It was a bit distressing for some of our staff because obviously their work tools and personal items were unavailable. We were not permitted to return to the building as it was too unsafe, and that caused some distress to our staff when they couldn't retrieve many of their personal items. And we really wanted to stress that we were operating normally as possible. So we, in those early days, obviously we had to say that we were closed, but we were very quick to ensure our academic community that the library was operating as well as it possibly could under the circumstances. Three months after the earthquake, the elevator shafts had been stabilised enough for us to return safely to the building. For people with disabilities who could not walk up the stairs, we provided a retrieval service. We also created a staff area on the ground floor for any staff who could not use the stairs. There are also student areas for students to undertake research who could not walk those stairs too. I guess one silver lining during this time was that the basement was where most damage occurred. This meant that the physical collections on the other 6 floors were accessible and were primarily undamaged, with only minor shelving collapses that were easily restored. However, the basement collections remained unavailable, and many had to be eventually destroyed due to water damage that occurred during the rebuild process. The silver lining here was that we were able to purchase substantial digital collections to replace the discarded material. So what did we learn about this disaster? Well, no disaster and its conditions will be the same. It is important to be prepared and then expect that there will be many matters and issues that you have to deal with along the way, many of which you would never have thought of. The size of the disaster adds complexity. A standard business continuity plan is certainly a great start, but you may find that it's not enough. But I am forever grateful that we did have a BCP that we could pull out and enact immediately after the disaster occurred. Rebuilding can be very slow, and therefore it is important to build up your collaboration with academics and the broader community. All our other library networks and relationships are also essential, both nationally and internationally. Disasters are very expensive. It is not just around what we need to do about the physical infrastructure, but it's also how we support it through our digital services and so on, how we look after our staff, where we put them, purchase of equipment, and so on. Expert advice will assist you with those tough decisions. So I was working very closely with those structural engineers, and they were able to explain to our community what was happening. We tried to be as transparent as possible, and that helped people understand why things were taking a long period of time. Communication is everything. The more factual, honest and detailed, the better. In the early days, I think for the first 3 months, I would provide an update at least once a day, if not twice or 3 times a day. If you don't do that, people read between the lines and can catastrophize matters that just aren't true. So it's very important to be able to explain things clearly. Again, this is where it was very useful to get the advice from the structural engineers who could explain things, although at times I translated engineering talk into a little bit easier for people to understand what was happening. The staff were amazing. I'll be forever grateful for how the staff just did anything they could to support the university during this difficult time. And they wanted to be on campus. They didn't want to work from home. They wanted to throw their energies into supporting the university, and it was wonderful to see. At times they worked in really awful conditions, stuffy rooms all packed in together, but that's what they wanted to do. They all wanted to contribute. And so we had many milestones, however small, that we celebrated and gave opportunity to thank our staff and our university community for their patience. And it certainly brought home to me that a library is more than a building. It is very much the people in it who provides the services. And what was also very clear, that library staff are contingency experts, or ninjas as we called them. And this is valued by the university community, including the very senior staff of the university. They could rely on us, trust us, to just get on with what we needed to do to keep our services functioning. And again, we did celebrate that quite often to make sure that we were valued acknowledged for our great work. And finally, the ultimate silver lining, our digital collections really saved us during this long period, we were able to move some very skeptical academics about ebooks, for example. When the basement was closed and we bought many ebook collections, they really valued how that meant that they could continue teaching and undertaking their research. So this really was, despite it being so disruptive, we were able to really move that thinking from the importance of a physical collection to how valuable our digital collections are. So thank you for listening, and I hope that I will be there to answer your questions.
Thank you very much for your sharing, Janet, and it's great that you are here on the panel today. So if participants have any questions, please do put those in the chat and we will pick those up after all three presentations are concluded and make sure that we have plenty of time for interaction with our speakers. Our second speaker is Dr. Yayoi Kitamura, who is professor at Nagano University of Health and Medicine. Dr. Yayoi Kitamura is a prominent figure in the field of disability-inclusive disaster risk reduction. She is associated with the National Rehabilitation Center in Japan for persons with disabilities, and Dr. Kitamura has contributed significantly to research and practices aimed at ensuring that disaster preparedness and response efforts are inclusive of persons with disabilities. Her work includes some co-authored reports and participation in initiatives that focus on improving disaster resilience for vulnerable populations. Her presentation covers what are libraries expected to do for persons with disabilities concerning disaster risk reduction. So let's play the next presentation, please.
I will talk about what a library is expected to do for persons with disabilities concerning on disaster risk reduction. Human casualties in libraries during major earthquakes have been reported in a small number of cases. In the Great East Japan Earthquake 2011, 8 public library staff were killed or missing in Iwate Prefecture and 2 in Miyagi Prefecture. Injuries included 1 library staff and 2 library visitors due to falling objects in Ibaraki Prefecture. Although not found in the literature, damage to library staff members and visitors is also expected in libraries which are affected by the tsunami. 3 types of human damage can be identified from past disasters. 1. Being swept away by the tsunami. 2. Being injured during evacuation. And 3. Being injured by falling equipment and books. For these, 3 points are considered necessary. First, secure and deal with the environment. 2. Provide evacuation support. And 3. Provide information. So this presentation introduces how to deal with and prevent disasters. In addition, I will introduce some points for libraries to prepare as supporting network for registered users and an evacuation shelter. Simple tools and experience of training by library staff, including volunteers, will contribute to ensuring safety. On ensuring the safety of library staff and library visitors, checking and reinforcing the earthquake resistance of the building, taking measures to prevent equipment and books from falling over and falling down, and securing evacuation routes are essential. Check with the elevator management company what to do if an elevator in the building becomes trapped. It is comforting to have a disaster cabinet in the elevator. It is also necessary to check the disaster risks around the facility using hazard maps published by local authorities. The location of evacuation shelters, evacuation sites, and the safety of evacuation routes should be confirmed, not only on maps, but also by actually walking through them during drills. As it is often not possible for all staff to participate in drills, information on disaster preparedness should be updated and provided on an yearly basis in the facility's newsletter and at events. Staff should receive training in first aid from the Red Cross and other organizations and be equipped with basic first aid supplies in case there are injuries at the library after a major earthquake. It is a good idea to check the local government's regional disaster management plan and consider how to transport people when he or she is injured, which hospitals and vehicles can be used, where wheelchairs and stretchers are located, and how they should be used. Because it is difficult to dispatch ambulances after a major earthquake. As the number of librarians alone is not enough to provide mobility support, they should ask library visitors and employees of neighboring offices to help. Check the hazards of evacuation routes in advance. For example, whether they are 90 centimeters wide enough for a wheelchair to pass through. Trainings are also required for this purpose at libraries. Visually impaired people are expected to be guided on a one-to-one basis, if possible. Although visually impaired people who come to the library alone, they may not be familiar with evacuation routes in the event of a disaster, because falling objects may hinder their movement or a power failure may stop the traffic lights. If the wheelchair is lightweight, 3 or 4 people can take it down the stairs with the person in the wheelchair. 1 person on each side and 1 in the back, with 1 person in the back balancing on each side. Increases stability. However, it is not easy to descend the stairs directly behind. Therefore, it is safer to place 2 people on each side, as shown in the illustration. As a rule, the wheelchair should face up and hold a fixed place except for the wheels and armrests. When the person carrying the wheelchair stands up, the wheelchair is lifted high, which is scary for the person in the wheelchair. A height of 20 to 30 centimeters above the floor is helpful, but the person carrying it has a sore back. It is safer to try lifting and walking the wheelchair once on a flat surface before moving it up or down the stairs. In libraries on higher floors, 2 or 3 pairs of people take it in turns to lower the person down. For long-distance lowering, rubber gloves can ease the pain in the palm of the hands. They are available from $10 to $40. If the elevator can't be used, only people in heavy wheelchairs should be taken down the stairs by 4 or 6 people using a cloth stretcher, shown in the left photograph. A cloth stretcher can be purchased online for about $30. On the flat floor, it can be placed on a blanket and moved by 1 person by pulling on the blanket as shown in the middle photograph. If the visitor trunk can be held securely, a back-mounted carrier shown in the right below photo can be used. The carrier is available online from $30 to $100. Practice is useful because escape routes can be dark, narrow, and have high steps. In addition to the person carrying the person, someone is needed to carry the baggage, open doors, and check safety in the direction of evacuation. It is also important for libraries to encourage wheelchair users and other persons requiring assistance to be prepared to instruct themselves on how to transport and give necessary care. In the event of mobility difficulties for library visitors injured in a disaster, a spare wheelchair may be useful, in addition to clothes stretchers, back-mounted carrier, and rubber gloves. Ensuring accessibility of information related to life in a disaster is even more necessary for people with disabilities and others affected by disasters in normal times. When the disaster occurred, it is also necessary to ensure that evacuation instructions and other evacuation information is conveyed to, and in some cases, guide visitors who are inside the library. They might have hard of seeing, hard of hearing, hard of language difficulties due to intellectual, developmental, or mental disabilities and international origins. After guiding them, it is advisable to inform the shelter operators of the methods to communicate with evacuees with disabilities. As a way of dealing with a situation where librarians do not have time to inform, it is expected that libraries and other institutions prepare materials or provide information in advance so that people who need assistance themselves can ask the effective method of communicating information to the evacuation shelter operators. It is also important for librarians to participate in drills at neighboring evacuation shelters and to establish a system of cooperation with evacuation shelter operators and others. Information of the registered library users who are using information accessibility such as reading services and electronic books is useful for checking whether they need assistance in living through a disaster. The information consists of name, address, and telephone number. As a library, it is worth considering promoting disaster preparedness among registered users and obtaining consent from registered users to make an agreement to share the information with reliable external supporters in the event of a disaster. In Japan, SAPIE Electronic Library, which is operated by National Association of Information Service Facilities for the Visually Impaired, offers library services as well as community and daily life information services, and SAPIE Network member facilities have designated disaster prevention staff to cooperate with each other in the event of a disaster to provide support for users with disabilities. In some cases, libraries are designated as evacuation shelters due to their location, and in other cases, they are designated as evacuation shelter after a disaster. The challenges when a library becomes an evacuation shelter are considered to be: 1. It does not have an accommodation, such as cooking, bedding, and bathing. 2. The staff has few experience in setting up and running evacuation centers, and the number of staff is limited. If the library is designated as an evacuation shelter, or if it is expected to assume the function of a shelter based on the surrounding situation, training should be conducted in accordance with the local government's manual for opening and operating shelters, and guidelines for setting up welfare corners for people in special needs. We expect that international and national network of libraries will work for disability-inclusive disaster risk reduction. Thank you.
Thank Thank you very much, Dr. Yayoi Kitamura, for that fascinating presentation on considering the needs and support needed for people with disabilities in disasters. As I mentioned in the chat, if you have any questions, please do raise those in the chat on Zoom, and we will pick those up at the end of the session. Our final speaker today is Betty Williams, who is librarian and archivist at the Reserve Bank of Vanuatu. Betty's experience working as a librarian and archivist spans over 25 years. She is a committee member representing Vanuatu in the IFLA regional division, and Betty was appointed by the minister responsible for culture to be a council member in the country. So Betty Williams will give us a talk on cyclones in Vanuatu and the response from the libraries there dealing with disasters. So let's play the final presentation now, please.
Hello, everyone. I work as a senior librarian and archivist at the Reserve Bank of Vanuatu. I am a council member of the Vanuatu Cultural Council, which is the body that oversees the Vanuatu Cultural Center. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to be able to share our story here, especially during the event of a disaster, and in our case, the severe tropical cyclones. So I will now be presenting on When a Disaster Strikes, Part 2, Vanuatu Case on Libraries and Archives Building and Collection. As we all know, Vanuatu is an island nation which is situated in the western direction of Fiji and north of Australia and New Zealand. It has a total population of around 300,000. The islands of Vanuatu lie directly on top of the Ring of Fire and is known to be vulnerable to the effects of climate change and exposed to numerous environmental hazards, in particularly the cyclones. And it's out-of-season cyclone occurrence that we have encountered recently, which is scaled and rated up to Category 5 severe tropical cyclones. The density of these devastating cyclone events occur here each year and positioning Vanuatu as the highest rate of risk to natural disaster with a value near to 50% overall. I will be sharing our experience, especially at the Reserve Bank of Vanuatu, the experience we faced during Cyclone Palm, which has been an eye-opening for us, in terms of our building capacity for cyclone and earthquake proof, building that has to be certified as a requirement by the Vanuatu government. However, there was a slight oversight in the window shutters requirement, and this story also reflected on the recent encountered by the National Library of Vanuatu and the National Archives of Vanuatu during the twin cyclone Kevin and Judy. The two example issues will be presented during this presentation: the National Library of Vanuatu and the Library of the Reserve Bank of Vanuatu. During the passage of the Category 5 Cyclone Palm, with a high density of wind speed from the top level of the RPV building, especially the window shutters that give in from the wind force that resulted in rain coming in, which in turn damaged a lot of files and records, painting and other artifacts in the building. However, the library, since it's in the ground floor, was well protected, has very minimum damage to it, and the collection was safe. However, in the recent event of the twin cyclone, a part of the ceiling from the National Library of Vanuatu and an opening in the building, which has been designed by the building engineers to allow enough light and ventilation to the library collection room, it wasn't anticipated to be any problem. While everyone responds to the preparedness plan, however, the strong force of the wind and rain has done some damage to the building as well as the collection. This in turn resulted in most of the space inside the building, which was full of water, that in turn caused damage to the shelves, the floor, the ceiling, and the collection. A 20-feet container roof was damaged and caused leakage to the container, thus damaging most of the boxes containing records that has been stored there. On the case of the Reserve Bank building, that building is certified as cyclone and earthquake proof. However, on the upper level of the 8 stories building, the window shutters is not included and was also designed to open from inside. The gale force wind from the cyclone bomb forces the window to open, which lead to the wet floor and damage of files and records from the upper offices. Preparedness plan. With a lesson learned from the severe cyclones, Pam, Harold, and the two twin cyclone Kevin and Judy, we have put in measures to be resilient in all our preparedness action plan, which include staff checking the library and archive premises and making sure there is no big tree close by, loose objects, and prepare the building to withstand the cyclone. Install window shutters, checking all library and archive collection, and making sure they are lifted from the floor in case of flooding. Staff covers all computers and library shelves of books using the black poly roll. Switch off all electrical devices. Use storage container to store sensitive collection such as newspapers and new books which has just been shelved. Ensure windows and doors are closed tightly and locked, and bath towels and blankets are inserted under the doors and windows to prevent water coming in through doors and windows. So these are some of the pictures that show the preparedness plan that we have. As you can see in the pictures, the poly roll and the plastics and the books are taken out and fill up in the storage container. And collection are lifted and put and placed on the table for in case of flooding. Recovery plan. In the event of a post-cyclone response, our recovery action plan usually outlined here as staff are cleared from the cyclone warnings and had to check in at their library and archive premises to check for damages caused. After attending to their home and families, staff are feel themselves to clean, sweep, and mop all the wet and clean any broken objects lying around. Checking all library and archive collection and making sure if any of those collections are wet and slightly damaged. Purchase cleaning detergent and cleaning items. Purchase special soft tissues and other wiping tissues to dry up wet books, etc. Clean front office using water plaster. Wipe down in all offices and dry all wet collection and record damaged items. So here is some of the pictures showing recovery procedures that we have applied to wet books and wet papers. This is some of the pictures showing the National Library staff, and we are glad to say that the Reserve Bank Library staff has gone over during the twin cyclones to help them give some of the ideas so that they can dry up all the wet books over there in the National Library. So here is some of the pictures showing recovery procedures that we have applied to wet books and wet papers. This is some of the pictures showing the National Library staff, and we are glad to say that the Reserve Bank Library staff has gone over during the twin cyclones to help them give some of the ideas so that they can dry up all the wet books over there in the National Library. To conclude our presentation, we would like to present our future plan, way forward into looking into more safe and disaster-proof housing and architecture concept, where we can integrate a cyclone traditional house such as this concept which has been which has been introduced from an individual on cyclone-proof tombs in Vanuatu. You can read more on the website link below provided here, https www.telipos.news cyclone-proof tombs in Vanuatu. This idea is taken from some of the traditional ideas of housing here in Vanuatu and has been converted into modern housing. With this lesson learned, we have polished up our preparedness and response recovery plan to best tackle these issues and to further proven careful management of disaster responses, which will in turn reduce further damages to the library and archive building and collection. When a cyclone is entering the Vanuatu cyclone trapping map, we will immediately activate and implement our disaster preparedness and recovery plan. One of our future plans also is to educate all school libraries and community libraries in Vanuatu on how to use our simple disaster preparedness recovery action plan to secure their libraries and its collections during and in the event of an approaching disaster such as a severe tropical cyclone. And also a high time to kickstart and look into ways where we can digitize our collection and build library online content. And that's the end of my presentation. And if you wish to contact me, I can be reached at my email given at the beginning of my presentation, or you can reach me at pwilliams@rbv.gov.vu to ask your questions. Many thanks.
Thank you, Betty, and thank you all three of our presenters for some real food for thought, some very harrowing examples of disasters and some very inspirational stories of how the library team stepped up and worked to recover from those different types of incidents and issues that were faced. We have just over 10 minutes for questions now. Betty, our final speaker, is traveling currently, so she is not able to join, but as I mentioned previously, and as Betty mentioned in her closing remarks, any questions we can refer to Betty via email. We do have on the call Dr. Yayoi Kitamura, who is also traveling and may not be able to reply live, and our first speaker, Janet, as well, who is also here. So we'll keep an eye on the chat. Meanwhile, I'll start with my first question on the presentations. And all of the examples today show how disasters or major incidents in libraries lead to major material losses. Janet, in your presentation, you highlighted that disasters are very expensive, as you put it. How have you found the experience of working with institutional leadership or even insurance companies to ensure that, in practical terms, the library obtains the necessary resources to recover as quickly and effectively as possible? And are there any tips that you would share with participants on how to engage with stakeholders in terms of making sure the library is able to recover from those material losses as quickly and effectively as possible? I wonder if you have any observations from your own experience in that respect.
Ben, often those very expensive costs are not under your control, so they would come under property services or university executive. We did have the opportunity to emphasize the importance of purchasing digital resources to replace the ones that we had damaged, and the university was very supportive of that, as were our vendors, who gave us good deals, so to speak, to help us with that as well. The major expenses were really with the building and you know, it takes many years for insurances to come through and so on. And that can be a disadvantage to begin with, but in these types of situations, the university really works well together to ensure that we, you know, continuity of our service continues.
Janet, and I suppose getting a sympathetic hearing from suppliers when you're talking about acquiring large digital resources is another of those silver linings in the wake of disaster, that you probably get a more receptive conversation going with suppliers than if it's a cold call and without that that background. Talking of silver linings and digital collections, I wonder, I suppose this relates to what you spoke about, Janet, but also all three speakers. How do you think libraries can prepare for the digital equivalent of a flood? So if we're going to rely more often on digitized collections, do we need, as libraries, to be preparing for the loss of those kinds of collections? How can we prepare for that kind of risk? And is it something that your contingency plans are starting to look at, as well as the physical losses?
Do you mean the ones we purchase or the ones we digitize?
Both, Janet, both types.
Resources, you would also ensure that you had various options of holding those, and I guess the same for our electronic resources. I did like the previous presentation around thinking about recovery as well, and thinking about it ahead of time. Also, the people with disabilities, making sure that those plans were practiced even. I think that if you're in regions where natural disasters, or you prepare for them, the better. And that is thinking about what we do if our electronic resources aren't available too.
Thanks very much, Janet. Linda.
We don't have anything in the chat. However, when I was listening to you, Janet, I was actually thinking that your big disaster happened in 2016, and I was wondering if one of the silver linings was that your experience made you more resilient when we entered COVID lockdowns, or in reverse, if the COVID lockdowns and our shift to digital mean that you'd be in a different place if you faced that disaster now.
Absolutely, we were far more resilient in COVID. We sort of joked about it, saying, "Oh, we're ready for this one." So having gone through that experience, not that I'd recommend it, but certainly helped us with our lockdowns in COVID.
Question, Janet, on that COVID experience, you mentioned in your presentation that there was a real keenness from the team to come and work on site rather than sit back and work from home, or not necessarily even sit back and work from home, but to work remotely while the recovery from the disaster was happening. Do you think that culture would be the same today, or do you think that it would change if there were another situation to deal with where staff could work remotely? Do you think that's changed after COVID and the work from home impact that has had around the world?
I think that what happened with COVID was very similar, Ben. What I mean by that is that as we, in New Zealand, we came back to work through level 3, and we asked staff if they were willing to return, and many staff put their hand up and volunteered, because they weren't made to assist us during those early return days to COVID. I think there might be a slight shift when people are more accustomed to working from home, but I was delighted that so many put their hands up and said, no, we have to come and help our library, our university community. But yes, I think that COVID, that shift in thinking would impact in the future, but it is nice to see our staff willing to come on campus.
I think the point that you made during your presentation as well about the outstanding response from staff members, from library team members in the wake of these disasters is very awe-inspiring. And I think in the first webinar, we saw that in the examples that were presented, that staff do step up and pull out all the stops to make sure that the library can recover in those situations. And there's such an important part of any business plan. It's not just about business continuity plan. It's not just about having all the procedures in place, but actually it's also ensuring that we utilize that incredible asset, which is staff enthusiasm and commitment to making sure the library recovers from these awful situations.
Absolutely. They're the most, we're amazing, I have to say. Down to the last person, there was this genuine desire to just keep working. There was, in 2 years, there were no complaints about a library building, or a building, wasn't just a library, having no elevators for almost 2 years. So that, I guess, indicates how willing people were to accept the difficulties and just get on with it.
Fabulous. And as I say, it's something which has come through in both the webinars about the importance of library staff in helping to recover from natural disasters or incidents that affect our libraries. We're coming towards the end of our allotted time. Linda, is there anything in the chat, any final questions to pick up from the audience?
No, I do have a very quick one for Janet. The water damage in the basement seems to have happened after the event, and you mentioned that that was during the building work. I was just wondering actually what caused that, and if in reflection there was something that could have been done to prevent it, as a sort of takeaway for us all to learn a lesson.
It was I can't remember actually what broke, but it was just one of those things, Linda. It was a very, very complex building, fixing it. And I believe that there were just some water pipes that were accidentally broken. How you could prevent it, probably not. If that was prevented, something else might go wrong. So it's just being prepared. So the material, we couldn't move a lot of the material because of the danger of the building wasn't, it just wasn't appropriate for us to move it. However, we did move most of the resources that were important. So the resources that were badly damaged, we could lose without much impact. So I guess it's just being prepared as much as you can, but expect the unexpected and just deal with it.
It's always the law of unexpected consequences, isn't it, Janet?
That's fabulous, and we're out of time. So I'd like to thank you, our audience, for joining us, our speakers, Janet, Yayoi, and Betty, and Linda for co-hosting and for your questions and interventions, and the wonderful technical team from the National Library of Scotland. So thank you, Lydia, for operating the Zoom behind the scenes. Before we go, I'd like to remind you as a final call about the IFLA Information Future Summit, which is happening next week from the 30th of September to the 3rd of October. Registrations close tomorrow on the 27th of September, Just Google IFLA Information Future Summits if you are interested, or go to 2024.ifla.org. Thank you very much for your participation, and goodbye.